Imperial Hammerman here with a list of the top 10 best books of fiction. Let me talk about the criteria about the top 10 best books, because first of all, any top 10 list is going to be very, very subjective. And I totally get that. I understand that that the next person is going to come up with 10 different books, and maybe a guy is going to come up with 10 different books than a girl is. But to talk to you about the criteria, these are books that I've read more than once. These are books that have stuck with me. These are books that when I read them the first time, they just engrossed me like some kind of guilty pleasure, almost like, who cares what the subject matter is? I'm enjoying this, and I don't want to get away from it. They're the kind of book that if you were to get on a 40-hour flight to Burma, you would be fine with that, because you're so into the book that you just don't want to stop reading it. This is going to be one of my wild card books. I have a couple of nonfiction wild card books at the end. I agree with what Dean Koontz said in his book, How to Write Best-Selling Fiction. That is that fiction, that writing is meant to be read. And if your writing or your book is not read and enjoyed, it is not meeting its purpose. And so for me, there's a lot of books that aren't going to be on my list. You might think, why isn't War and Peace on my list? Well, it's an awesome book. I totally agree with that. But if I get on a 48-hour to Burma, it's not going to be my first pick. I'm going to want to pick something that is going to entertain my brains out. And these are the books that I like, and I'll tell you why during this video. Okay. By the way, that is a wild card on my list. This is a great book, and I'll tell you why later on. Number 1. The Da Vinci Code. If you have not read the Da Vinci Code, where have you been? Really, the Da Vinci Code, when I first read this book, I couldn't put it down, and I don't know how many gazillion books. It says the #1 worldwide bestseller book. No kidding. When I read this book, I could not, 40 million copies sold, and this is an older version. No kidding. I mean, if you've never read this book and you don't know what to read, you're going to be entertained by this book, even if you're embarrassed by that fact. Unfortunately, the rest of Dan Brown's books are not as entertaining, but the Da Vinci Code, wow. It's a story about a guy who gets on the tail of a conspiracy that Da Vinci once upon a time had a hand in, and uncovers this plot that involves the Catholic Church, religion, and even Jesus Christ himself. If you don't know what this book is about, I'm not going to try to explain it. Read the back cover. An amazing book. It will entertain you. If you've not read it, you will not regret reading it. Also, there is this version of the Da Vinci Code that has all of the art in it that, frankly, when I read this book the second time, I read this version, it was kind of cool because you could see all the different pictures of Da Vinci and what Dan Brown was talking about, and I highly recommend that version as well. Here's my old beat-up copy of The Lord of the Rings. Again, it's almost like if you've been in a cave, maybe you've never heard of Lord of the Rings. If you've never read it, you've got to read it before you pass away, because it's one of the absolute best and most entertaining books of fiction that's ever been written. As far as the genre of science fiction, I mean, it has inspired generations of writers. Again, The Lord of the Rings, if you've never read it, it's easily one of the best books that you could ever read. And if you're at a loss as to what to read, easily one of the best recommendations anybody could ever give. George Orwell's 1984. Again, an awesome book. And it's sort of in this age of where privacy is being trampled on by governments and corporations alike, where the United States is itself turned into somewhat of a surveillance state. Wow, it's time to read 1984 in this year of 2014. You know, it's kind of depressing story in a way, because it doesn't have a great ending. But, you know, it's about a guy who is stuck in a dreary lifestyle but wants to have a little bit of fun, and he meets a woman, and they start to have a romance, but they get caught in this world where Big Brother and the eye of Big Brother is watching everything they do. It's a very poignant and timely story to read, and it's also amazingly well written and very inspiring. Again, this is the sort of book that when you start reading it, you don't want to do anything else but finish this book until it's done. George Orwell, 1984. How could any modern list of the best books ever be complete without mentioning Harry Potter? And by mentioning Harry Potter, I mean the whole series. Again, you know what the story is about. Don't you wish that you could erase your memory and read this series for the first time, and just have them all lined up, all 7 books or however many books there are, and just read them all? I mean, what an amazing storyline. And yes, it was for children, but you know, we're all children. We all want to be entertained. We all want to get lost in a story that seems real almost, because J.K. Rowling created a world that seemed so real, and in a way, and so inspiring and full of characters that we could all relate to, especially as a kid, because you know, everyone carries their childhood around with them. Harry Potter. If you haven't read these books and you can read, what have you been doing? Read this. You won't regret it. I have a few wild card books in here. After all, it's my list. One book that really got me, that you probably never heard of, is The Morning Tree by Austin Reams. This book, kind of in the vein of the Da Vinci Code, I suppose, but not exactly. If you have any background in biblical studies or the Bible, you're going to love this book. And also, if you are a Bible thumper, I'm sorry for that term, you're going to be a little bit shocked by the storyline. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you the storyline. And by the way, here's some spoilers. Starts out, there's this centurion, and it's the centurion from the Bible who went to Jesus and asked Jesus to heal his servant. And, Reams takes that servant and says, well, he's the main character of this story, except he's kind of a badass, and his Achilles heel is that he's allergic to sunlight. And some of the disciples come to the centurion and said, hey, there's this rogue disciple who has, and it's after Jesus has died on the cross, and there's this rogue, and the disciples come to the centurion and say, this rogue disciple has stolen a scroll that was written by Jesus. You can see the centurion on the front, and you need to go find it. First, he doesn't want to do it. And of course, he's allergic to sunlight. But then this angel appears to him and says, you know, and the centurion thinks that the quote unquote angel is Jesus. Well, the centurion goes, and of course, what do centurions do but kick butt? And he proceeds to do that, and you read the story kind of thinking that he's doing the right thing. But in the end, he ends up, and you think at first, he killing Jesus. And at least that's the implication. That's what Satan appears to him in the end, and the angel that appeared to him in the beginning of the book actually turned out to be the devil, and sent the centurion on this journey, killing people essentially. And Satan's like, don't you know that only evil people do the sort of thing I asked you to do? And of course, then you're kind of like, well, yeah. And the thing about this book that's astounding is that there's a lot of things. It's almost like there's a riddle in this book, and I've read it a few times, thinking that if there is, for example, every chapter starts out with the moon, and there's a date given but no year. And if you have, one of those moon calendars, you can actually figure out the year that the author is trying to say that all this stuff is going on, and it's very accurate as far as geography and history. And the main character even goes into Jerusalem during Passover, and there's an amazing description. Anyway, I'm not going to keep going into it. And one thing I will say, not to put you off on the story, is that while at the end Satan says you've killed Jesus, it doesn't actually appear to be accurate. Again, the centurion has been deceived. And, it really is. There's several twists at the very end. I thought it was an amazing book and very thought-provoking. I recommend it highly. It definitely would help if you grew up reading the Bible or something. But anyway, great book. Recommend it. Kurt Vonnegut, my goodness, what an amazing writer. He really does have a way with words and telling a story that is humorous and poignant, and that's just really an understatement and a half. I have two of his books that are just my favorites. One is Slaughterhouse-Five, which really, it's a sort of a science fiction in a way about a guy who is in World War II and gets caught and is traveling in time, backwards and forwards. And frankly, if you read books, I don't know how you've never heard of this book or never heard of Kurt Vonnegut. But again, if you haven't ever read of Kurt Vonnegut, absolutely one of the best books you could ever read, and it's funny, and it has kind of a nonviolent bent, which I personally appreciate. But an amazing book, definitely top 10 kind of book, and Breakfast of Champions. I'm not even going to try to describe it. Again, I just enjoyed this book. It's about a car salesman who sort of goes bonkers. And that doesn't even do it justice. Kurt Vonnegut, he could be writing about shoelaces and make it entertaining, and that in itself is an amazing ability. Because after all, as I said at the very beginning, it's about being entertained. When I read this book, I didn't want to put it down, and I've read it more than once. Highly recommend it. I think no list of fiction, best of the best, could be complete without mentioning Ira Lavin. And I have three of his books, all three of which I recommend equally and highly, although I think that Kiss Before Dying is probably my favorite. Rosemary's Baby, again, surely you know the story. It's about a girl who lives in I say a girl because she's young, who lives in New York City with her husband, and they move into an apartment, and it turns out the whole apartment is being occupied by witches, and long story short, Rosemary ends up having a baby that is the son of Satan. There's a great movie that's been made of this, and it follows the book exactly. And it's a morose story, but it's interesting because this particular copy has the introduction written by the author himself, and the author himself says it's not really about Satanists, although Satanists have apparently loved this book. It's more about the wickedness of upper middle class people living in New York, which is humorous in itself. But again, the book is riveting. It's amazingly well written, and the thing that's most amazing about Ira Lavin is how he writes. You could study any of his books, and it just is amazing how he builds tension. Boys from Brazil. Again, spoiler alert. It's a story about post-World War II. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from the Nazi internment camps, has escaped South America, and they are cloning Hitler, essentially, into little boys, and that's why it's called Boys from Brazil. Again, like this, look how little it is. This book is riveting. You could easily read it in a international flight, even if you're a slow reader, and it would just keep your attention. You wouldn't know where the time goes. Stephen King called Ira Levine the Swiss clockmaker of fiction, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing him, but if that's true, I don't feel like Stephen King, at least in his most recent books, has learned anything, although Stephen King is on my list. A Kiss Before Dying. I had put off reading this for some time, and wow, this book is only, this particular version is not even 200 pages. It's one of these old pyramid copies. But, I mean, wow, I read it very quickly. And even in 200 pages, Ira Levine really develops these characters in a way that... Then there is, picking back up on Ira Levine's books, A Kiss Before Dying. What an amazing book. This book is less than 200 pages in this version of it. And in 200 pages, Ira Levine develops characters in a way that by the end you feel like you know them. It's a story about somewhat of a frat boy / sociopath who's gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and she happens to be the daughter of a very rich person. And it kind of goes into how he slowly goes from trying to get her to have an abortion to plotting to kill her and then killing her, and then about how this evil character goes on to kill the girl's sister, and then even tries to kill her older sister. There are many amazing and shocking plot twists in this book, and it's amazing that Ira Levine does it in so little time and so little space. It really is Exhibit A for how to write a novel without using a bunch of words. Again, criticizing Stephen King, he has written books like Under the Dome that's over 1,000 words, and they're boring, and they're inefficient. A book like that, he spends all those words writing story about characters who you really don't care about. In this book, under 200 pages, I mean, in just few words, Ira Levine, you understand his characters. Amazing writer, amazing book. Now, after criticizing Stephen King, he is on my list. And some people call the three books that are his best are the S books. Salem's Lot, story about vampires that take over a small town. That's all I'm going to say about it. But when I read it, I couldn't put it down. I loved it. It's an amazing book. Again, that word amazing, but still, it's definitely on the list of books that if you haven't read it and you're looking for a book to read before you get on that flight to Burma, read it. It's a good book. Stephen King's The Shining. I read this book for the first time before the the made-for-television miniseries came out, and all I really knew of the story was the Jack Nicholson movie, and so in some ways I felt like I didn't really know that much about the story. It's just a great book. It's manageable in length. It's a story about a alcoholic who takes his family up, and they get snowed in at the Overlook Hotel, and it happens to be haunted. And the young boy of the family, he is psychic. The ghosts kind of take to him. All I can say is, this book, I couldn't put it down. I couldn't wait to get back to it. Awesome book. And then The Stand. The Stand, the third of the S books of Stephen King that are known as being some of the best. It's a story about the end of the world in a way that a flu, a super virus takes hold of the world and kills most of the people in the world, and the rest of the people, good and bad, are left to fight it out. If you've never heard of The Stand, I don't know why, because it really is a famous book. And if you haven't read it, read it. You'll enjoy it. Here's another kind of wild card book that I read recently, In the Miso Soup by Murakami. This is a Japanese writer, and it's been beautifully translated. I can't remember who translated it. It is the subject matter is a little shocking in a way. It's about a young guy in Japan, and his job is to take foreigners on tours of the sex trade district in Tokyo. And this guy named Frank shows up, and the main character, Kenji, I think his name is, takes Frank on a tour of Tokyo, and meanwhile, there's all these reports of a serial killer on the loose, and Kenji starts to wonder whether or not Frank is that serial killer. Well, it turns out that Frank is the serial killer, and that's where I'll leave it. But the thing about the book that is interesting is I don't think it's really about sex, and it's really not about violence, this book. Yes, there are some scenes where sex is discussed, but it really doesn't go into this long, drawn-out, derogatory or gratuitous sex scenes. It's not that about that at all. There are some scenes that are just terrifyingly violent, or I should say one scene. But again, it's not about the violence. The main character is really throughout all of this commenting on the clash of cultures between Japanese and Americans, and also talking about it's kind of a postmodern book in a way, just talking about saying things like that parents, government, and teachers teach you how to live the slave life, but they don't teach you how to live normally. I mean, just little comments like that. It really is a commentary on the status of things postmodern, after Vietnam, after World War II, and the X generation, and what we were to make of things. In some ways, in talking about the sex trade, he could be talking about the legal field or the doctor's profession, you name it, Wall Street. It is an astounding book. And if you can stomach a little bit of violence and a little bit of sex, it really isn't about that. And I could not stop reading this book. I recommend it. It's one of the best books I've ever read. The Fountainhead. If you are young and in college, and all you can think about is your career, this is ego on speed. It's about a architect who won't bend his principles in any way. He's never going to change. He's only going to do things the right way. Everyone else is wrong. He meets other powerful people that feel the same, and there's sort of a love story all entwined in there. If you've never heard of Ayn Rand, then I just don't know what to say. But this book, especially if you're kind of young and you're career-minded and you're a Republican running for vice president and she's your favorite, then this book is for you. It is an amazing story, and I don't really prescribe personally to her brand of selfishness, to her philosophy. Ayn Rand, really also a Russian. And she wrote a book about selfishness and how great selfishness is. Personally, I don't buy into that, and now that I'm older, I don't. I'm not so enamored with it, but I love it. I've read this book many times, and again, it's just it's an amazing story. And as I said, if you're just career-minded, this is sort of like pornography for the career-minded. Great book, and I recommend it highly. I sort of wrestle about whether or not I put this book on my list. Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. It's not a book in science fiction that you hear a lot about, but it's sort of a punk. In my mind, it's sort of a, Neil Stephenson Snow Crash punk, the first of the punk series, steampunk series, before steampunk was known. It's about a guy who's sort of a criminal, and he, busts out of a penal colony on the moon or a rock somewhere and goes back down to Earth at a time when people can travel without almost being transported. It's been a while since I've read it. Look it up on Amazon for the complete history of the book. It's an amazing book, though, and I recommend it. I'm going to dig out some other... I didn't have the hard copies of these other books. Shogun by James Clavel. This is sort of the quintessential... I use the word pornography. I'll use it again. Pornography for the American. I think in some ways it's every middle-aged American's dream to sort of be lost in some culture somewhere, and then get to know that culture and get steeped in it, and then to the point that you become one of them. Whether it's becoming I don't know. I mean, in this instance, it's becoming a samurai. And that's what the story is about. The main character, he's a Dutch sailor who gets caught in Japan before he was exposed to the West, and over time sort of becomes so steeped in the culture, he becomes a samurai in a way under this shogun. It's just riveting and well written, and it is just a guilty pleasure as far as books go, and I highly recommend that book. Ender's Game. Orson Scott Card, about kids in the future who, it sounds silly talking about it out loud, but kids in the future who are taken to and trained by the military and the government to fight off an alien invasion. It sounds very silly when you say it out loud, but all I can say is I did read this on a flight that took nearly 20 hours, and what a wonderful book. Very entertaining. It in my judgment, does what books are supposed to do: entertain. It gets you into that world. Deep reading. What a wonderful book. Read it. Enjoy it. Richard Matheson. He died not too long ago, and what a loss. One of my favorite books of his, What Dreams May Come. It's a story about a man who dies, and about his experiences in the afterlife, and then his wife dies, and she goes to hell. In the afterlife, he tries to save her from hell. It's written in such a way that it almost sounds real. And that's one of the most amazing things, which means that Matheson is an amazing writer. I also recommend I Am Legend, which, it's almost not even really a novel because it's so short. But What Dreams May Come, I've read this more than once, and it is a wonderful book. I mentioned at the beginning that this was about works of fiction, but I also said that it was about books that you couldn't put down. One book like that is Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. My mother recommended this book to me back in the day shortly after it came out, and I suppose I didn't read it because, after all, my mother had recommended it to me. And I thought, what do I want to read a story about climbing Mount Everest for? I've done some hiking, but I don't know squat about Mount Everest or about real mountain climbing. And I thought, why would I want to read that book? I thought it was going to be a fad. Years later, I read it, and I could not wait to get off work every day just so I could go back home and finish this book, because it's a true story about his experience climbing Mount Everest when a bunch of other people happened to be killed at the same time. Just astounding and riveting, and I wish, again, one of those books you almost wish you could forget you read it so you could read it again for the first time. And that kind of brings me back to one of my favorite books, How to Write Best-Selling Fiction. One of the things that's really cool about this book is that in the back of it, written by Dean Koontz. A lot of people disagree with his philosophy, and I just don't care. But this was written back in I think 1980 this is the first edition published in Britain. But he has a list of some of his favorite books. And honestly, any of these books on this list in the back, you could put on this list that I've been going through. And not that all of my books are on his list, but this is great. And he's a great writer. And after you read this book, you understand his philosophy a little bit better about why he writes books. One of my favorite books of his, and I should have put it on this list, but I didn't, is called Lightning. It's a love story in a way, but written from the perspective of a man able to travel forward in the future to repeatedly save the woman that he loves. Great book, Lightning by Dean Koontz, and this book by Dean Koontz. Well, that's pretty much it for me. Those are the books that I would recommend you read, although I'm not really sure I'd get on an airplane with this as my only book. But other than that one, any of these books that I just mentioned, if you've never read them and you're about to get locked into an elevator with, a boring group, hypothetically, any of these books that I have mentioned would make you forget where you are and what you're doing. And if you haven't read them, read them. I'd be happy to listen to anybody else's list. By all means, share your list of books that I should read if I happen to be stuck somewhere for 24 hours, like waiting for a plane to board in Newark. Just post your comments. Good luck to you.